April 7, 1945. East China Sea, south of Kyushu. The sea is restless, flecked with whitecaps beneath a thin, overcast sky. Through the gray mist, the battleship Yamato cuts a slow, deliberate path north, its massive hull trembling from the surge of engines burning their last reserves of fuel. Crewmen in worn uniforms clutch binoculars, scanning the horizon where hundreds of small black dots are growing. Dots that move, weave and swell into the wings of death. On the bridge, officers shout bearing reports. Below deck, fire control crews load shells the size of small cars. The steel monster, once hailed as the pride of the empire, the ship that could never sink, now sails toward an ocean crowded with enemies it cannot see. At 12:20 p.m., the first wave arrives. The air shivers under the roar of U.S. Navy carrier planes, Hellcats, Helldivers, Avengers, diving in perfect coordination. The Yamato's anti-aircraft guns open fire, sending walls of tracers into the sky. It is a vision of iron and flame. Japan's mightiest ship facing 300 American aircraft in the final act of its existence. The Pacific's balance of power will be decided not by armor or caliber, but by speed, precision, and the cold arithmetic of air supremacy. And at the heart of it all, Yamato, a symbol of national pride, about to become a floating inferno. In the late 1930s, Japan's naval architects stood at a crossroads. The Washington and London naval treaties had long restricted the size and tonnage of warships, favoring the Western powers. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, those treaties were shackles, symbols of humiliation that limited their dream of maritime dominance. When Japan withdrew from the treaties in 1934, the Admiralty made a quiet, radical decision: to build battleships so powerful that no enemy vessel could hope to stand against them. The result was Project A-140F6, the plan that would become the Yamato class, the largest battleships ever built. Conceived in secrecy at the Kure naval arsenal, these ships were to be the ultimate expressions of Japanese industrial might. 263 meters long, displacing 72,000 tons at full load, and armed with 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighed as much as a small car and could travel over 25 miles, striking with the kinetic force of a falling meteor. Engineers wrapped the ship in 16-inch thick armor plating, thicker than anything afloat. Even the command tower, known as the pagoda mast, was a fortress of steel. The ship's torpedo defense system was a multi-layered labyrinth of bulkheads designed to absorb and contain underwater explosions. To its creators, Yamato was not merely a ship. It was a floating empire, proof that Japan could defy any blockade, any bombardment, any foe. Inside the naval ministry, admirals whispered of a single decisive battle, a dream, inherited from Mahanian doctrine, in which the Imperial Navy would lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into Japan's waters and annihilate it with superior gunnery. Yamato was built for that duel, a steel god destined to decide the war with one thunderous exchange. But time was not on their side. Even as Yamato took shape under the covered dock at Kure, the world was changing faster than the steel could be laid. In Europe, dive bombers and torpedo planes were proving that aircraft, not battleships, could decide battles. The British carrier Ark Royal crippled the German Bismarck. The Royal Navy sank the Italian fleet at Taranto in a single night. The age of naval aviation had begun, but the Imperial Japanese Navy, obsessed with the symbolism of surface supremacy, pressed forward. By the time Yamato was commissioned in December 1941, Japan had already attacked Pearl Harbor. The Pacific was a chessboard exploding into fire, and Yamato was still being fitted for war. It would not fire its main guns in anger for more than a year, but in propaganda reels and newsreels, it was already legend. The unsinkable guardian of the empire. Sailors spoke of it with awe. Its hull number was a secret, its blueprints classified at the highest level. Even among the crew, few understood the scale of its construction. When the emperor himself toured the ship in 1943, He reportedly marveled at its size, its serenity at anchor, and its colossal guns silhouetted against the inland sea. Yet as Yamato rested under a rising sun flag, another empire was mastering the sky. By 1942 at Midway, Japan's carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, was shattered. In a single day, 4 fleet carriers went to the bottom. The decisive battle doctrine had failed before Yamato ever had a chance to fulfill it. Still, Japan held on to its faith. The admirals believed that when the tide turned, Yamato would sail, not as a weapon of conquest, but as a divine instrument of last resort. It was more than steel and armor now. It was hope, myth, and denial wrapped in the shape of a ship. And as the Pacific shifted toward an era of total air and sea integration, Yamato remained anchored in the old belief that size and strength could still defy the sky. By early 1945, that old belief was breaking apart as surely as Japan's empire itself. The U.S. Navy now ruled the Pacific with dozens of fast carriers, each one capable of launching 100 planes at a time. Wherever American task forces sailed, they carried with them a moving sky of destruction. Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers that could strike beyond the horizon. Japan's once proud surface fleet was reduced to fragments. The battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister, had been sent to the bottom during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Overwhelmed by air power, more than 250 bomb and torpedo hits recorded by witnesses. No amount of armor or gunnery could resist the swarm. The Imperial Navy's lesson was clear, but unspoken. The age of the battleship was dead. Yet in Tokyo, denial and desperation made strange allies. The Americans had landed on Okinawa on April 1, 1945, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific, less than 350 miles from Kyushu. Japan's homeland was next. With the skies lost, the generals turned to the seas one last time. In the underground war rooms of the Imperial General Headquarters, a plan emerged under the shadow of defeat. Codenamed Operation Tengo, it was less a strategy than a death sentence. Yamato, accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, would sail south to Okinawa. It would attack the American invasion fleet, ground itself on the shore, and fight until destroyed. The plan was sold as a noble sacrifice, a final stand of the Emperor's navy. But for the officers who knew the truth, it was suicide. The operation had fuel for only one-way travel, no air cover, no chance of surprise. Admiral Seiichi Ito, commander of the mission, protested bitterly. He argued that to waste Japan's last battleship in a hopeless assault was madness. But the pressure from Tokyo was relentless. From the Navy Ministry, from the combined fleet, from a culture that valued death with honor over life in defeat. Captain Kosaku Aruga, Yamato's commanding officer, understood. He was a career sailor, calm and precise, respected by his men. When the orders came, he bowed, accepted, and began preparing his ship for its final voyage. In the engine rooms, crews checked the turbines, powerful but thirsty, consuming tons of fuel oil every hour. The stokers knew they wouldn't be coming back. At dawn on April 6, 1945, Yamato's anchor lifted from Kure's harbor. The massive ship, accompanied by her escorts, moved through the Bungo Strait, heading into open water. The crew sang softly on deck, some wearing white headbands of the rising sun. In the wardroom, officers toasted sake in silence. The ship's radar screens were empty then, but above the clouds, American reconnaissance planes were already watching. From Task Force 58, Admiral Mark Mitchell received the report. The Yamato was at sea. To the Americans, this was not a battle. It was an opportunity. They would strike from the sky before the ship ever came within gun range. Over the next hours, Mitchell prepared his carriers. Essex, Bunker Hill, Hancock, Intrepid, and others, each turning into the wind to launch their planes in waves. Back aboard Yamato, sailors saw nothing yet but sea and sky. The horizon was flat, the water steel blue. The mission's code word, Ten Ichigo. Heaven number 1, echoed through the loudspeakers. It was to be a divine wind reborn at sea, the last gesture of a dying empire. As night fell, lookouts strained into the dark. The ship's wake glowed faintly with phosphorescence, its massive hull cutting through the swells. Some men wrote letters to their families. Others stood silently beneath the gun turrets, listening to the engines thrum beneath their feet. When dawn came on April 7th, the East China Sea was calm and empty. To the crew of Yamato, it looked like a good omen, but to the pilots already forming up hundreds of miles away, it was the perfect killing ground. Technological angle. The myth of invincibility. For nearly a decade, the Yamato had been a secret legend. Japanese engineers had built her to outgun and outlast anything afloat. Her armor belt was nearly half a meter thick, her turrets protected by steel blocks heavier than entire destroyers. Even her internal structure, a web of watertight compartments, was designed to shrug off torpedoes and bombs. Admirals boasted that no weapon in existence could pierce her defenses. But by 1945, the physics of war had changed. U.S. ordnance specialists had developed armor-piercing bombs like the AN-M66, capable of punching through battleship decks from high altitude. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo, once unreliable, had been perfected through relentless testing. Dropped in massed formations, they could cripple even the toughest hulls. Yamato's design, optimized for gunnery duels against other ships, was never meant to face hundreds of aircraft attacking from every direction. Her anti-aircraft battery, though formidable on paper, over 150 guns, from 127mm dual-purpose mounts to 25mm autocannons, was overwhelmed by the scale of the assault she would face. Each gun needed coordination, tracking, ammunition, and visibility. Smoke, shockwaves, and debris made that impossible. The truth was brutal. Armor could no longer protect a ship from the sky. The very thing that made Yamato magnificent, her size, made her an irresistible, slow-moving target. Her myth of invincibility was about to meet the mathematics of modern warfare. Tactical angle, the American blueprint for destruction. Admiral Mark Mitcher's pilots were not improvising. By 1945, the U.S. Navy had perfected the art of carrier warfare. Their attack doctrine was systematic, almost scientific. Fighters first, to clear the airspace and strafe exposed gunners. Dive bombers next, to crack open decks and superstructures. And torpedo planes last, to strike below the armor belt where no plating could save the ship. Each wave launched from multiple carriers, forming precise attack groups, F-6F Hellcats for cover, SB-2C Helldivers diving from 10,000 feet, and TBF Avengers skimming low over the waves. Communication between squadrons was crisp, timing exact. Radar pickets guided them to intercept positions, and by noon, the Yamato's coordinates were fixed. The attack plan was designed not only to sink, but to cripple. Pilots were instructed to focus torpedo runs on the port side of the battleship. Hitting one side repeatedly would induce a fatal list, reducing the effectiveness of her counterflooding measures. Once the list passed a certain angle, Yamato's guns could no longer aim properly, and her AA arcs would collapse. To American tacticians, it was a simple equation. Strike faster from every bearing, and never give the enemy time to recover. To Japanese officers watching from the bridge, it was chaos, a storm of engines, fire, and steel descending from every compass point. Human angle, the crew's ordeal. For the 3,000 men aboard Yamato, Tengo was not just a mission. It was a funeral procession in motion. Most were barely in their 20s. They had trained for surface duels, not for the sky collapsing around them. When the first aircraft appeared that April afternoon, the ship's alarm bell rang out through every deck. Crewmen sprinted to their battle stations. Bulkheads slammed shut. Ventilation stopped. The air grew thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Inside the gun turrets, men loaded shells the size of small cars, though there was little chance of using them effectively. On deck, others gripped the handles of Type 96 25mm guns, their ears bleeding from the noise, eyes burning from cordite smoke. Every few seconds, explosions rocked the hull. Shrapnel scythed across the open platforms. Survivors would later describe the moment as a nightmare of sound. The shriek of incoming bombs, the thud of torpedoes, the screams of wounded sailors as fires spread through the upper decks. Yet discipline held. Orders were followed. Damaged guns were replaced by manual fire. Hoses ran dry, but crews kept fighting. Even when the list began, slow at first, then growing, no one abandoned station. They had been told from the start there would be no return. The Yamato was their home, their duty, and now their grave. Leadership angle. Duty in defeat Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the task force from Yamato's flag bridge, was not a man of blind obedience. A thoughtful officer, he had argued against Operation Tengo until the final hour. He knew the operation's premise was absurd. No air cover, no refueling, no chance of reaching Okinawa alive. But Japan's naval tradition was steeped in the code of Giri, obligation. Once the emperor's will was implied, resistance became impossible. Ito had told his staff, "If we go, it is not for victory, it is for the nation's pride." On the morning of April 7th, as reports of approaching U.S. aircraft reached the bridge, he remained calm. He instructed his communications officers to maintain silence, his gunnery chiefs to hold fire until targets were within range. When torpedo hits began shaking the ship, Ito ordered counter-flooding operations, directing engineers to offset the list. Captain Kosaku Aruga, his executive partner in command, moved constantly between stations, from the wheelhouse to the secondary guns, coordinating responses amid smoke and panic. His face, survivors later recalled, never changed. Even as shells detonated around the bridge, Aruga gave orders in a steady voice. Both men knew the truth. Their mission had ceased to be military. It was ceremonial. An act of sacrifice to show Japan still had spirit. When it became clear Yamato would not survive, Ito refused evacuation. He bowed to his officers and remained on the bridge until the final explosion consumed him. Aruga followed, choosing to die with his ship. Leadership, in that moment, meant surrendering not to the enemy, but to fate. Intelligence angle. Eyes over the horizon. While Yamato's crew believed they had slipped quietly through the Bungo Strait, American intelligence had been tracking them almost from the start. PBY Catalinas and long-range PB-4Y privateers had sighted the task force early on April 6th. Each report was relayed to Task Force 58, giving Admiral Mitcher precise coordinates and speed estimates. The Americans understood the opportunity. To sink Yamato, the symbol of Japanese naval might, would be more than a tactical victory. It would be psychological annihilation. Mitcher's staff plotted intercept vectors overnight. The U.S. had radar picket destroyers extending their eyes hundreds of miles across the sea, and scout bombers confirmed Yamato's position by 08:00 a.m. the next morning. By the time the first wave of aircraft launched from Essex, Bunker Hill, Hancock, and Intrepid, Yamato was already inside a closing net. Her lookouts might spot the planes visually, but she had no radar capable of detecting the full scale of what was coming. It was not a duel. It was an execution planned with mathematical precision. From the air, Yamato's wake was visible for miles, a pale scar against the deep green water. To American pilots, she was not just a ship. She was a target glowing in the sun, moving steadily through open water with no air cover, no concealment, no hope. Moral and symbolic angle. The death of an idea. Yamato's final voyage was more than a naval disaster. It was the collapse of a philosophy. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 2 decades believing that honor and steel could overcome technology and strategy. The ship itself was a national monument to that faith. Built in secret, wrapped in myth, and paraded in propaganda as the unsinkable guardian of Japan. But on April 7, 1945, that illusion disintegrated under the weight of 300 American aircraft. The destruction of Yamato was not just the loss of a battleship. It was the death of the idea that courage alone could defy progress. The men aboard fought bravely, some manning guns until they melted, others refusing to abandon their posts as the decks split open. Yet courage could not outfly a Hellcat, nor outmaneuver a torpedo. In Tokyo, when news of Yamato's loss reached the naval staff, there was silence. One officer reportedly said, "The heart of the fleet has stopped beating." It was not simply defeat. It was the realization that Japan's navy, once feared across the Pacific, had no future left in the war's final months. And so as the smoke of that day spread across the East China Sea, one era of naval warfare ended forever, and another, ruled by air power, began its reign. April 7, 1945, East China Sea, 12:01 p.m. The first radar contacts flickered across U.S. carrier screens just after midday, dozens of dots converging on a single location. The Yamato task force, sailing at 22 knots through open water. On the flight decks of Essex, Bunker Hill, Bennington, and Hancock, deck crews worked in rhythm, arming bombs, fueling Avengers, checking the release mechanisms of torpedoes. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, sunlight glinting off goggles, the smell of aviation fuel sharp in the wind. At 10:45 a.m., the first strike group lifted off. By 11:30, more than 280 aircraft were airborne, forming up in layered waves at altitudes ranging from 200 to 10,000 feet. From above, the Pacific was an endless mirror. From below, the Yamato's lookouts spotted dark specks emerging from the southern sky. The alarm klaxon blared through every deck. "Air attack! Starboard! Prepare for battle!" The battleship's AA batteries opened up, tracing white lines through the air. 5-inch guns fired proximity-fused shells. Triple-barreled 25mm cannons stitched bursts of fire into the haze. But the sky was too full, too fast. The first wave of F-6F Hellcats came screaming in, strafing the open decks to pin down gunners. Seconds later, SB-2C Helldivers rolled inverted and dove almost vertically, releasing 1,000-pound bombs aimed at the midship section. Explosions tore through the upper deck, shredding radar masts and igniting ammunition boxes. The secondary turret number 3 was hit. Flames leapt across the pagoda mast. Smoke filled the bridge and fragments whirled like shrapnel snow. Below, engineers reported flooding in the forward engine rooms, 2 torpedo hits to port. The ship began to list, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Captain Aruga ordered counter-flooding. Flood starboard compartments to even the roll. But the damage was spreading faster than the pumps could manage. Electric circuits shorted. Communication lines went dead. Crewmen crawled through half-submerged corridors, sealing hatches as water roared in. At 12:32 p.m., a second wave descended. Avengers flying low at 150 feet, torpedoes slung beneath their bellies. The sea around Yamato erupted as torpedoes struck the port side, each hit lifting the hull in slow, violent arcs. Inside, men were thrown against bulkheads. Steam burst from broken pipes. Power flickered, then died. On deck, anti-aircraft gunners continued firing blindly into smoke and sky. They watched as American planes dove through walls of tracer fire, released their payloads, and climbed away into the clouds, each one leaving trails of destruction. Admiral Ito remained on the bridge, surrounded by shattered glass and burning insulation. He could still see the horizon, a pale line beyond the fire. He gave one final order: maintain speed, keep heading south. But south was no longer a direction. It was an illusion of duty, vanishing under the storm that now surrounded them. By 12:45 p.m., Yamato had taken at least 6 torpedo hits and 10 bomb strikes. Her list reached 15 degrees to port. The sea began to claim her balance. Her mighty guns, built to duel at 25 miles, were now useless, angled toward the sky like monuments to a dead doctrine. Still, the battle raged. American squadrons circled for another pass. Radio chatter buzzed across the airwaves, coordinates, headings, altitude corrections. To them, this was a mission objective. Target confirmed, neutralize threat. To the men aboard Yamato, it was the end of the world in fragments of metal and flame. The battleship still fought back, firing main guns at attacking aircraft. Each shell created shockwaves that nearly tore the ship's seams. Yet, the psychological effect was undeniable. The sky itself seemed to recoil with every thunderous shot, even as the bombs continued to fall. Below decks, sailors tried to pump out flooding compartments, but the pumps had failed. The list grew steeper. Ammunition stores caught fire, the smell of burning oil mixed with seawater and blood. And yet, through all of it, discipline endured. Crews carried wounded men to the weather deck. Medics worked in the open under strafing runs. Every man knew what was coming, but none left his post. The ship's heart, her engine rooms, still throbbed, driving the propellers one last time through the growing smoke. But the sea was already deciding the outcome. By 1 p.m., the second wave of U.S. aircraft had completed their runs, and the sea around Yamato churned like boiling metal. Her great hull was scarred and blackened. Fires burned from bow to stern. The smell of burning oil spread for miles. Still, the battleship refused to die. Her crew fought with a kind of grim endurance born of duty and despair. At 1:15 p.m., more Avengers appeared, flying in from the southwest. Their torpedoes struck almost simultaneously, 4 more impacts along the port side. The ship shuddered violently. Compartments flooded in seconds. The list deepened past 20 degrees. Officers shouted counter-flooding commands, but many starboard compartments were already destroyed. The internal hydraulics that powered the turrets failed, locking the massive guns in place. In the fire control center, instruments melted from the heat. Gun crews operated manually, passing shells by hand, even as water crept up their ankles. When they ran out of targets, some men stood at attention, saluting the burning flag above the bridge. At 1:30 p.m., Yamato's speed dropped to 10 knots. Her escorts, Yahagi and several destroyers, were also under heavy attack. The cruiser Yahagi, already hit by torpedoes, capsized and sank, taking most of her 1,000-man crew with her. The destroyers Asashimo and Hamikaze were engulfed in flames. The formation had disintegrated. Every ship now fought alone. Above the chaos, U.S. pilots reported seeing columns of smoke rising 20,000 feet into the air. "Target hit," came the transmissions. Clipped, efficient, unemotional. To them, this was a mission complete. To the men below, it was annihilation. By 2 p.m., Yamato was fighting only for dignity. Her port list had reached 25 degrees, and her deck was half submerged. Captain Aruga still stood on the bridge, issuing damage reports to compartments that no longer existed. Admiral Ito, composed to the end, gave permission for any crew who wished to abandon ship to do so, though few did. Lifeboats were destroyed. The sea itself burned with leaking fuel. At 2:20 p.m., the final wave arrived. Avengers from Essex and Bunker Hill, flying low through the smoke. They launched their torpedoes in a coordinated pattern, striking Yamato on the starboard side to finish the kill. The last hits ripped open the hull near the forward magazines. Inside, temperatures rose past critical limits. At 2:23 p.m., a massive flash erupted from below deck. The main magazine detonated, 6,000 tons of explosives igniting in an instant. The blast obliterated the entire forward section of the ship, sending a mushroom cloud of flame and debris 6 kilometers into the sky. U.S. pilots reported the explosion as visible from over 100 miles away. The Yamato broke in two. The bow vanished first, then the stern rolled, capsizing with a thunderous roar. The sea swallowed Japan's greatest warship in under 2 minutes. The shockwave flattened waves across the East China Sea. Floating debris rained down for nearly half an hour. Out of more than 3,000 crewmen, only about 270 survived, dragged from the water by destroyers that themselves limped home under attack. Among the dead were Admiral Ito and Captain Aruga, still on the bridge when the explosion came. The ocean fell silent again. Only oil slicks and burning wreckage marked the grave of the ship once called Unsinkable. Above, U.S. pilots circled briefly, then turned back toward their carriers. The mission was over. A fleet built on steel and pride had been undone by a few hours of coordinated air power. The greatest battleship in history had lasted barely 2.5 hours against the changing face of war. When the sea finally calmed, the silence felt unreal. Only drifting debris and oil fires remained where Japan's last great battleship had stood moments earlier. Waves rolled gently over the wreckage, black with fuel and ash. The East China Sea, which had echoed with thunder and fire, became a floating grave for thousands of men, sailors, gunners, engineers, swallowed by history in less than 3 hours. From the few survivors rescued by destroyers like Fuyuzuki and Hatsushimo, fragments of testimony emerged. One sailor remembered the water boiling with flame. Another said the explosion lifted the sky. Some clung to planks for hours, their faces burned, their uniforms shredded by shrapnel. Others were sucked down by the whirlpool as Yamato split in two. Many went down singing the imperial anthem. In the aftermath, the U.S. Navy compiled its reports with professional detachment. 386 aircraft had been launched against the Yamato task force. 227 reached the target. Out of those, only 10 planes were lost. A staggering confirmation of American air superiority. The torpedo planes had scored at least 10 confirmed hits, and dive bombers over a dozen more. Yamato's own gunners claimed to have shot down more than 20 attackers, but it made no difference. The Japanese formation had ceased to exist. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers, Hamikaze, Asashimo, Isokaze, and Kasumi, were sunk outright. The survivors, crippled and burning, limped back toward Sasebo and Kure, carrying wounded men whose skin had been scorched raw by burning oil. Of the 3,132 officers and crew who had departed Kure on April 6th, only 276 lived to see land again. In Tokyo, the Naval Ministry received the news on the evening of April 8th. The message was brief, almost sterile. Yamato sunk in action. Heavy loss of life. Inside the once proud Imperial Navy headquarters, no one spoke. Officers stared at the telegram, knowing what it meant. The last hope of Japan's surface fleet had gone to the bottom. Not in glory, but in fire. For the American pilots and commanders, there was satisfaction, but not celebration. To them, it had been a demonstration, the ultimate proof that the era of battleships was over. Admiral Raymond Spruance later remarked that Yamato's destruction settled a question that should have been answered years earlier. The U.S. fleet lost just 12 airmen, fewer lives than Yamato lost every second in her final hour. In the following days, survivors were brought ashore, dazed and hollow-eyed. They spoke little. Some refused food. Others stared toward the sea, whispering the names of friends who had been vaporized in the final explosion. Captain Aruga's body was never found. Admiral Ito's remains were never recovered. Both were posthumously promoted and awarded the Order of the Golden Kite. But the honors rang hollow in a nation collapsing under air raids and starvation. In Hiroshima Prefecture, where Yamato had been built in secret a decade earlier, factory workers wept openly when the news spread. For many, the battleship had been a symbol of pride, proof that Japan could rival the industrial giants of the West. Its loss marked more than a naval defeat. It was the death of an illusion. At sea, American reconnaissance planes flew over the wreck site days later. What they saw was haunting. A vast oil slick stretching miles across the water, dotted with floating debris, gun barrels, helmets, fragments of pagoda mast, life vests scorched to cinders. Beneath that black surface lay the twisted bones of the largest warship ever built. The ocean had reclaimed the pride of an empire. The sinking of Yamato sent shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. Within days, the news reached the imperial palace. Emperor Hirohito, who had once toured the ship as a symbol of national strength, received the report in silence. According to witnesses, he lowered his head and said nothing. It was a moment of reckoning, not only for the emperor, but for a nation built on the belief that spirit and sacrifice could triumph over material might. For the Japanese Navy, the loss was final and symbolic. Yamato had not merely been a battleship, it had been the heart of a doctrine. Since the 1920s, naval strategists in Tokyo had believed in the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, where Japan's surface fleet would meet the enemy head-on and win through superior gunnery and discipline. It was a romantic vision rooted in an earlier age, when battleships were the ultimate arbiters of empire. But Yamato's destruction proved beyond doubt that the era of battleships was over. Armor and size no longer determined survival. Speed, range, and air power did. What had taken 10 years and thousands of workers to build was undone in just over 2 hours by aircraft that cost less than one of Yamato's shells. In strategic terms, the loss had little effect on the Battle of Okinawa, which raged on for months. The U.S. invasion fleet, over 2,400 ships, never even saw Yamato. But psychologically, the impact was immense. For Japan's sailors, the message was unmistakable. The sea no longer belonged to them. Every major warship was now trapped in port, vulnerable to airstrikes. The once mighty combined fleet had become a ghost force. In the United States, the victory was hailed as a triumph of modern warfare. War correspondents wrote about the death of the last giant. Photographs from carrier decks showed pilots smiling wearily, standing beside their planes streaked with salt and oil. Behind them, the Pacific stretched into infinity, a symbol of a new kind of dominance. Yet even among American officers, there was a sense of awe. Many had studied Yamato's specifications for years, marveling at its power. Seeing it destroyed so completely left a strange melancholy. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the after-action reports, called it a magnificent waste, a monument to outdated thinking. For Japan, however, Yamato's demise carried a deeper tragedy. It represented the collapse of an entire worldview, one that prized sacrifice over survival, pride over pragmatism. The thousands who went down with the ship were not fanatics. They were men caught in the machinery of a doomed empire, obeying orders they knew led only to death. In post-war Japan, the name Yamato took on new meaning. It ceased to be a symbol of militarism and became instead a metaphor for the country itself. In literature and film, Yamato came to represent the beauty and futility of blind devotion, the sorrow of a generation that believed it was fighting for eternity, but drowned in the tide of modernity. At the bottom of the East China Sea, the wreck rested for decades in silence. It was rediscovered in 1985, lying in two massive sections at a depth of over 1,200 feet, the hull inverted, the pagoda mast torn away. Divers described a landscape of twisted steel and coral, a monument to ambition and loss. And above it all, life had returned. Fish swam through the broken gun barrels. Coral grew over the scars. The sea had claimed Yamato completely, transforming her from weapon to reef, from the pride of an empire to part of the living ocean. For Japan, there would be no more battleships, only memory, only lessons carved in salt and steel. In the end, Yamato's story is not merely about a ship. It is about the transformation of war itself. When she was conceived, the battleship was the pinnacle of human engineering, the ultimate measure of a nation's power. Her guns were the largest ever built, her armor the thickest, her presence the most imposing. Yet her fate showed that strength alone cannot stand against change. The sea that swallowed Yamato also buried the old world she represented, a world that believed glory could be measured in steel and sacrifice. The ocean did not care for myth or honor. It answered only to physics, to progress, to the cold logic of innovation. For the men aboard her, the final hours were not about empire or doctrine. They were about endurance, about holding the line of duty even as the sky itself fell upon them. In that, Yamato's crew achieved a different kind of immortality, not through victory, but through the quiet dignity of facing the impossible without turning away. Today, when divers descend to her resting place, they do not see a weapon. They see a tomb, a silent cathedral of steel and coral still standing against the currents. The name Yamato, once shouted in pride, now drifts like an echo across the water, reminding the world how quickly might becomes memory. Because the true legacy of Yamato is not her destruction, it is the lesson she left behind. That technology changes faster than tradition, that pride can blind even the greatest powers, and that every empire, no matter how vast, eventually meets its reckoning in the quiet depth of time. The sea remembers everything, even the ships that were said to be unsinkable. If you were moved by the story of Yamato, Japan's final battleship and the end of an era, remember that every wreck beneath the sea carries A lesson written in steel. Subscribe for more untold histories of courage, technology, and the men who faced impossible odds. Like, share, and comment to keep these forgotten stories alive. History fades when we stop telling it.